It takes two. I thought one was enough. It's not true. It takes two of you. Just the two of us. It takes two.
Welcome to It Takes Two, a mentorship podcast. My name is Simon Miron. I'll be your moderator for this session. I have two wonderful people here with me, and I'll just ask you to feel free to introduce yourselves, offer up your pronouns if you feel so inclined, and if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your artistic practice. Maybe Mady, if you want to get us started.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mady Richard. My pronouns are she, her. Yeah, I grew up as a competitive dancer, which was always my main thing. And then I was kind of into musical theater, but didn't have time for it. And then I graduated high school and I realized I could go to university and do theater. So I've been doing that at the U of M. I did a couple years with the Village Conservatory, which was great. And then that's when I was exposed to creation and writing my own stuff and creating my own stuff. And I haven't been able to let that go since, so I've just been exploring that in a lot of different ways.
Thanks, Mady. I'll pass it on to Yvette.
Hi, Yvette Indigenous. Kitaganzibi Nongdanjba. My name is Yvette Nolan. My people are from Kitaganzibi Algonquin First Nation in Quebec, but I was born in Saskatchewan and grew up in Winnipeg and have lived all over the country. And now I'm back in Saskatchewan, beaming in from Saskatoon, which is Treaty 6 territory. I'm a playwright, a director, a dramaturge. Been doing this for 30 odd years. And yeah, it's really great to be working on this project with Mady back in my hometown.
Awesome. Thanks, you two. What a wonderful treat to have you both on here with us. And we're looking forward to spending a little bit of time to get to know you better and get to know this process that you've undertaken. Mady, if you don't mind getting us started, what led you to apply for this project?
Yeah, I was doing a resident artist thing this summer with One Trunk, and I was enjoying creation as I do. And I just wanted to keep going. And the idea of having a mentor, a professional mentor to help me out was really cool. And then we had done a playwriting workshop, so I had been intrigued by playwriting specifically. And so then that was something I decided I wanted to explore. Then yeah, just figuring out how to connect myself with Indigenous theater more, since that's something that hasn't really been a part of my artistic journey yet.
What was it like for you to be contacted by us and kind of to know Mady a little bit from the start?
It was great. I'm always so thrilled when I'm introduced to emerging Indigenous artists, because we still are so few. We still don't have, critical mass, and it's just really exciting to me when we find new people who are interested in. And I'm a theater rat. I mean, I did anything and everything to stay in the theater. That's what Winnipeg did to me, Mady. I got sucked into the black hole, literally, at the University of Manitoba when I was doing my undergrad, and never stopped. By the time I graduated with my undergrad, I was working as a theater professional, but I would do anything to be in the theater. So I hung lights, I laid dance floor, and eventually started working at the Winnipeg Fringe, where I saw plays being made, and most of them were not very good. And I was like, surely I could do better than that. And that's how I started writing plays. So Winnipeg was a crucible for me. Winnipeg was where I started my career. Winnipeg should have way more Indigenous artists coming out of it because of the population there. But, the way the world works, we're still not there. So when Village Conservatory reached out and said, hey, there's a young artist here who we think you might want to work with, I was like, I am so there. And especially so exciting when we started talking in our first meeting. And I'm like, so what do you want to do? And Maddie's like, I want to do playwriting. And I was like, right on. Here we go. It's not easy, but let's do it.
You talked a little bit about some of your artistic practices. Mady coming principally from a dance background, and Yvette kind of getting your fingers in all sorts of different things. Mady, where do you feel your artistic practice is now, or where do you feel like you're headed now?
That's a good question. I mean, because I was always, when I was like, okay, I'm going to do theater, I thought of it as in a performance way, I was going to be on stage doing musicals. And then now I'm writing now, and I want to keep writing. So that's just been really cool.
Do you feel like, that takes away from other things, or do you feel like you can continue to pursue performance as well as creation?
Yeah, like I definitely feel like I can pursue both things. I feel like there's just so many things that I want to do. So I would just want to keep doing as much as I can because I enjoy it.
That's great. I mean, like Yvette was saying before, it's really great to be able to, sharpen several different kinds of skills because you never know what's going to come up the pipeline. And I don't know, one of the things that we've been trying to build through the Vic programming, not to like do my own self-promotion, my own Vic hat wearing here, but it is just to try to encourage people to do different things because, your seasons can grow and adapt in different ways. Some days, some years you'll have lots of shows and some years you'll have less shows. And being able to have those skills to do other things when maybe you're not performing in productions that other theaters are producing. I personally think that's a really important and critical thing. What are your feelings in regards to that, Yvette, to kind of juggling multiple facets of theater, of creation, of performance?
I think it's like you, critical and imperative, because some seasons there's going to be a pandemic and there won't be any performing.
No.
And that's when you get a lot of time to develop your writing skills, to work as dramaturge, to work in readings on the Zoom machine. Also, a career is funny. Like everybody starts thinking they're going to be an actor. And along the way, you start discovering the other things that you like to do or you want to do, like writing, like directing. I think it's great to have a big toolbox with lots of tools in it so that you can, for me, it's meant that I didn't have to have a day job. I haven't had a straight job for decades now because I have enough skills to work in theater and a bunch of other ways. Sometimes that's administration, and sometimes you have to go like, yeah, I can't do this anymore because if you're a good administrator, nobody wants to let you do anything else. Same like being a stage manager, right? If you're a good stage manager, no one will let you act because stage managers are more precious than actors.
Yeah.
But if you acquire those skills, then you are in a position to do almost anything and stay working in the theater where you keep practicing and you keep acquiring skills.
That's really great. I hope that we can get to a point where people continue to have that value system, because I think diversity in practice, diversity in the work that you do is so important. It's a real key to survival in the arts and continuing to work. So why don't we shift things over a little bit? I'm just curious if either of you had any particular expectations coming into this project. Why don't we start with Yvette? What were you expecting to happen? What were you hoping for coming into this?
I had no idea. My biggest expectation was I would meet a young Indigenous artist.
Awesome.
I had no idea what Mady's practice was. Mm-hmm. We have lots of things in common, including Winnipeg, including growing up as an urban Aboriginal, including presenting this way, which is, for those of you out in the podcast land, which is I can pass as white or ambiguously ethnic. Mm-hmm. And that's a certain way of growing up. Mm-hmm. And so those are things that we had in common that we discovered really quickly in our first discussions, plus the playwriting thing. Plus Mady did dance. I did ballet when we moved to the city until I was 14 years old.
Oh, yeah.
The Royal Winnipeg Ballet. So there's a bunch of affinity there. What was I expecting? I was just like, what do you want to do? I'm here to talk to you about that. And we did a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. Mady's read more plays in the last 4 weeks, I think. I give homework.
Good for you. That's great. Well, why don't I flip things over to Mady? Did you have any kind of expectations or any kind of big hopes coming in?
I kept my expectations pretty open. I was like, cool, I'm gonna meet like this Indigenous artist and we're gonna write something, and I was just very open to anything that I didn't want to like restrict my expectations to like, okay, this needs to happen or else this was a waste.
You were talking about your process and kind of some of the homework and some of the different things that you were doing over these last 4 or so weeks. What kind of discoveries did you make, maybe about yourself or your partner? Mady, why don't you get us started?
Writing there's so much to it and it just never ends. Like I'd write like a couple pages and then it would open up so many questions that Yvette would ask at our next meeting that I hadn't even like thought of exploring. And it's like, I've got like a couple pages, but there's so much more that these characters could go towards. And like, there's just a whole new world created just from that being written.
Cool.
Like scary at the same time.
Yeah. How did you find the process of writing yourself? Did you discover anything anything about yourself that you maybe didn't know or were uncertain about in some of these exercises that you tried out?
I learned that I need to distance myself a bit from the characters that I write. So it's not just like me writing about a character named Mady, which I have done before, which is part of why I wanted to explore like writing dialogue and like things that weren't just pieces that were me talking to the audience.
Yeah.
And so then having like a character with a different name, a different life story was neat, but then also having like similar experiences so that I could still write about that.
Most playwrights say that there's a piece of them in every character of their work, but finding that balance of not just writing from your specific point of view, but finding other characters, other points of view, even though there's your shared experience within that narrative, within those explorations. Yvette, anything that you discovered or any kind of new things that came to light in working with Mady over these last few weeks?
It's always a joy to me when I start working with a playwright who gets plays. And Mady gets dialogue and gets plays and knows how to, the scene that she's recording today started as one thing and kept expanding and kept changing and kept adding without getting exposition-y. So Mady knows how to write plays where everything is in the dialogue and there's very little stage direction. And that is fantastic because it's a hard thing to teach. So I think, being a theater creature and being an actor and starting to direct and having done some creation for self, all of that helps when you get into the playwriting where you're writing characters. That was a great discovery because some of those things are really hard to teach. But like I said, I also gave her plays. Also funny that Mady was like, I said, what are you interested in talking about? What are you curious about? And she said, well, this identity thing, but I don't just want to write identity plays. And I'm like, okay, you can write whatever you want. But of course, the thing that Maddie's been working on is a play about that identity, right? Like mixed Indigenous white in an urban center. And it's funny. That's the other thing that I was really thrilled to see. Mady writes funny. Like the scene is funny from the top and still serious.
As Mady mentioned earlier, we had the great pleasure of working with Mady for a few years in the past, and we got the luxury of discovering her sense of humor. And that's not a surprise to us in any way, shape, or form, but that's really great to hear. You're talking about some really interesting themes that I wouldn't mind kind of digging into if you feel so inclined. I also kind of want to sidebar and ask, what were the plays that you read?
Salt Baby and The Birds, Susan Laurie Parks' Play a Day.
So why don't we dig into that theme a little bit more? Do you feel comfortable sharing with us, I should say, a little bit more about what it's like to be an urban Indigenous person and trying to explore that theme, writing about something that's very personal, but as well trying to juggle that thing of allowing your experience to be sort of presented through the eyes of other characters?
Growing up, it was a thing I was aware of, but it was never something I actually acknowledged until like a couple years ago, really. It wasn't really something I incorporated into my art. For some reason, I was always very separate. Like, I separated myself and what I created, and like my identity didn't really overlap with that as much as it could have. And so that was definitely something I wanted to explore with this. The setting is just, there's a girl, and she's with this guy she's reuniting with after they went to school when they were younger. And so he's kind of trying to flirt with her. She's not into it. Well, then the family keeps showing up and makes her feel like she's like on display, basically. So then they have to acknowledge the differences like racially between them and just all these like, it's about just like the small little things that add up, which are like, a lot of them are like real examples.
Yvette, what was it like grappling this subject matter, kind of helping Mady explore this?
Because our experience is so similar, Winnipeg, mixed family. I also told Mady stories about what it was like for me as a young person in Winnipeg. And sometimes it's the same. Like Maddie's putting stuff into her script. I'm like, that I've been there.
Yeah.
I've done that. It's so interesting to me that nothing has changed in 30 years or something. Which is why when we started talking immediately, I sent her Salt Baby by Phelan Johnson, which is about a young Indigenous woman who presents white, hence the title Salt Baby. It's what they call babies, Indigenous babies on her res, who present white. And it's that character's grappling with what it means to be like wanting to hang on to your identity and be proud of your identity, but at the same time resenting the exotification of your identity.
Yeah.
So it becomes the only thing about you that people are hooking onto. So it was interesting to be like, yeah, you see it like generation after generation, we're still all dealing with this, but every story is different, even though it's that we all have similar sort of moments in our lives and how we grapple with them, and that the world has changed in the time since I was a young woman, since Phelan wrote Salt Baby. We never get tired of it. Like the world never gets tired of it. And right now we're all in this huge discussion about identity, and especially Indigenous identity, who gets to say who's Indigenous. And that's a thing that affects this whole country. So not just Mady and Yvette, not just Sammy, her character based on Mady, everybody, all Canadians are affected by this question right now.
Yeah, I think that's really astute. I was listening to the radio on my way to, yes, I still listen to the radio. It's wonderful. On my way to a performance yesterday, there was a discussion about this issue of Indigenous sovereignty in, I think it was Finland, where there's this new legislation that came out about who gets to decide who's part of this Indigenous group. And there's this large group of people who are very wealthy and have a lot of power who are trying to influence that. And so it's interesting to hear that it's not only a Canadian issue, that the issue of Indigenous identity is happening all over the world. And I just find it really interesting that all these discussions are kind of like coming out now in a way that's a little bit, I'm just seeing and hearing more about it than maybe I did when I was younger. Or at least, I maybe just wasn't aware of it in my own wonderful naivete. When you talk about urban indigeneity, I'm really fascinated about hearing more about that because I'm a Métis person. I discovered my Indigenous ancestry when I was about a teenager. And so I found myself trying to grapple with figuring out how to find that piece of my culture. I'm just interested in hearing more about this experience as a, what we're calling urban Indigenous person. From my experience, a lot of people equate indigeneity to, ancient traditions, which are beautiful and wonderful, but is only one piece of the Indigenous experience. And I'm just curious if either of you want to elaborate on that.
For me, I feel like I grew up without really any culture from either side. And so, like, there was just no connection to anything there. And yeah, like, I've just been raised, like, I've lived in 3 houses all within, like, 2 minutes from each other on the same side of the city. Like, I don't really have many experiences. And that's part of, like, why I've wanted to use theater, which is something I love, to connect with Indigenous culture and identity.
Yeah, certainly me too. Growing up in Winnipeg, like we arrived there when I was 6. My mother had been in a couple of residential schools and married my father straight out of residential school. He was her math teacher. And then we moved around a bit, and then we moved to Winnipeg. So it's not my territory. It's not my mother's territory. She was married to a white man. She had lost her status because of that. So none of us had status. And then as she started to find her way back to her culture, she never got back to her res, which was in Quebec, but she started to connect to sort of the urban Aboriginal, the friendship center. She started Children of the Earth with Priscilla Settee, which is a survival school in Winnipeg. And part of that was in response to her having lost so much of her culture, having been taken from her community when she was 7.
Yeah.
So as she found her way back, I found my way in. And so that was my experience in the city. I taught drama at Children of the Earth. My mother worked in a group home that's largely naturally Indigenous kids.
Mm-hmm.
So I would go and do drama games with them. So I was finding my way to culture in what the city offered me, which was Indigenous, the friendship centers, the powwows that were close. Every year, when I was a teenager, we would drive to Quebec and spend 2 weeks in the bush with my grandparents. So I had a connection to them, but not a living with them kind of experience.
Yeah.
Theater is a way of finding your way to culture. When I ran Native Earth in Toronto, Indigenous artists would show up all the time at the door and be like, I don't know anything about, I'm not really connected to my culture because I was scooped, because I was adopted, because all of the reasons. And we'd be like, okay, come on in. And then they would find their way to culture through the art, through working on being around other Indigenous people. And we were all different, like we're all different nations at Native Earth. And that, I think, is one of the things that theater can do for us, not just for us, like Mady and me and all of the artists who came through Native Earth, but us, the audiences can also find their way into what it means to be Indigenous and what it means to be living with Indigenous on this land when you don't know anything about them. So that goes for white Canadians as well as for us, because of colonization, because of the diaspora, because of all of those things.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate your points of view. I'm going to move on to another question, if that's okay. Do you mind sharing a bit more about your process throughout these 4 weeks? You talked about some of the homework that you had to do and some of the writing that you did. Is there anything else that you missed out on? Or do you want to you could even share what it was like to go through those 4 weeks and some of the different things that you did over that time?
I mean, we'd meet and we'd just chat a lot. So that was very nice about like anything. We'd talk about like the writing and like questions about that and just where to go with that. And then usually I'd just be left with like some plays and just keep writing was what Yvette always wanted, which I did. And then, yeah, that was basically just our meetings would just be a cycle of like, we chat about things that are going on in our lives. And then we talk about the writing and we talk about the plays.
Yeah, because Mady was also directing at school at the same time. So we also talked about the process of directing and about pedagogy, really, and how we are taught, how that does or does not flow with Indigenous worldview. Like how we're being taught things by people who were taught things a long time ago and the world has changed.
Yeah.
So we talked about that. Mady wrote and has a drive open where I could go in and look at what she was writing, how she was revising things, which was really great. Nice that we're coming to the end of our time together, except I said, and this is what it's like in Indigenous country, now we're in relationship and now you can't actually get rid of me. So, so this is the way it works, right? But all theater is relational, and Indigenous worldview, everything is relational. So it makes like you can't just stop and I'm going to just keep A, sending her plays to read, and B, asking to see where she's at with the writing. I mean, how do you work together if you don't know each other?
Yeah. You were talking a bit before about trying to address the way that people are teaching. And I think that kind of touches in on what you were just talking about kind of getting to know who you're working with and trying to help them discover their process in what they're trying to do, as opposed to enforcing some sort of other view on them. You were mentioning about in directing, talking about Indigenous perspectives in education and in directing. Do you mind elaborating on that a little bit more? I'm really fascinated to hear more about that. You know, Mady, you were working on a piece, you were doing some directing at the time. What was it like to be working on that through, an institution that has maybe a shape that's a little bit more, I'll go out on a leap here and say rigid or something along those lines, and then coming back and trying to share that experience with Yvette and seeing what feedback you'd get from that. What was that like? Theater
in school where you get grades is so interesting because I'm directing the scene. And then I'm like, okay, there are choices I can make. Which ones are going to get me the best grade?
Right.
Like, as much as I could try to genuinely be like, okay, I want to make this the best scene that
Hmm.
I want,
Yeah.
it's still present and just something that I can't ignore.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have done some directing in my experience, and I've never had to direct for a grade. I can't imagine what kind of like weird mind twisting, bending that would do in trying to figure out, as opposed to, I don't know, from my meager experience, I would think that, you know, you're generally trying to help the actors discover the most interesting and fruitful work. But if you're being graded, that's a really weird thing to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah.
Wow.
Plus, the material that you're given in university is just frustrating. If everything is connected, sometimes the material you're given makes it really hard to understand how everything is connected. If we're looking at British plays from the last century,
Yeah.
or you know, like if we're looking like at exclusively at work that is, I'm making air quotes, canonical, then
Right.
how does that speak to who we are in this day and age? Also, you know, like directing for a grade, servant of two masters, right? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah.
I told
Yeah.
Mady about when I was in university and directing at the U of M and got flunked by a professor for the way I had directed a scene. And I was like, I went and challenged it, of course, because I'm always been sort of a disturber, a disruptor. So, I mean, one of the things that we talked about when we were talking about being in the institution is touching the bases lightly and without too much anxiety, taking the tools, like everything is a tool, learn it, put it in your toolbox, maybe never use it again, but then you've got it in there. And it's like, or also the way that works when you're learning directing is like, you run into actors later on who were also trained in this, and you can understand why they are in a certain place because you've had the same training as they have. It doesn't mean you have to do it the same, but it does mean that you can understand why it feels so weird and awkward.
That's really interesting. Geez, I just want to, I just want to hang out and chat some more about these things because, you know, like egotistically, I'm also, I'll call myself an emerging director, and you know, I just find it really fascinating what you're talking about, and kind of looking at those points of view and perspectives. I feel like you're just really sharing this beautiful perspective of what it is, what it means to be an Indigenous person trying to navigate these situations, and the institution of arts education, or if you want to call, you know, the institution of theater creation in Canada or in Winnipeg specifically, and the weird hoops and the weird challenges that Indigenous people are still facing, whether it's there's so little representation that the work is undervalued, or just like a lack of understanding and flexibility in trying to open up the processes to a more holistic or Indigenous, or I don't know what the right word is, viewpoint or framework. It's just really cool and interesting. I'm curious where you envision yourself moving forward now that this mentorship, this introduction to this mentorship has kind of concluded with the work that we're going to capture of Mady's work. Yvette, you were saying earlier how this is sort of just the beginning and now we're sort of stuck with each other. Do you feel like you can elaborate a little bit on how you might envision moving forward after this process? Why don't you get us started, Yvette?
Sure. Because, you know, I get into these relationships through these kinds of pairings sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it takes and sometimes it doesn't take, and you finish the relationship or the gig and you're like, bye. But sometimes those people go from being whatever this relationship, mentor-mentee relationship is, into more of a collegial relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I did a mentor-mentee thing with Katie German a couple of years ago, and now Katie and I were just colleagues, right? And so it's an ongoing relationship. We're so dependent on our network anyway in this business that I think it's a good lesson that we make relationships, and then you tend your relationships so that your network is strong and your people are strong. Colin Wolfe, who is the artistic director of Quandock now. I knew him when he was a student at university, but now now we're in a collegial relationship, but he also still calls me. And like, in fact, today he's like, have you got time for a phone call? I need to talk about this play I'm working on, Mady. And so I think that's what happens. If it's a click, if it's a fit, if both people feel like they want to go forward, then you go forward with it. Because we make those relationships and that's who we are.
What about you, Mady? How do you envision this moving forward?
I would love to stay in touch with Yvette. Absolutely. Just love to be being sent plays and getting to read them and discuss them, and just cool to have this person that I know now who's done it and who's in the business, and it's really cool to have that connection now.
Speaks sort of to the value of the core idea behind this wonderful little project, which is mentorship. Yeah, the Vic really feels strongly about trying to find ways to start these dialogues, and that, mentorship can happen in several different ways. You can be lucky enough to enter into a sort of mentorship program, but I also want to, make sure that people know that, like Yvette was saying, that, mentorship is really just relationships, and it can just start with a cup of coffee. And if you find an artist that you're really interested in, or that whose work really inspires you, or somebody that's doing stuff that you want to do, that's never a bad idea to just reach out and see if you can connect with people. There's this weird hierarchical system that keeps people from making connections, which is really unfortunate, because I just feel you were kind of saying that before, Yvette, that's sort of what the business is all about.
Absolutely. And it's a strange construct, that hierarchical shape, for a business that is theoretically collaborative, but we still impose this sort of hierarchy on it.
Yeah, it really baffles me. But here we are, I was just wondering if there's anything else that you want to share, anything that maybe I've missed, or any other kind of stories or things that you feel that the listeners might want to hear about, or things that you were just dying to say that I just failed to acknowledge.
I mean, I feel like I could talk about the weird power dynamics they teach you at university for a long time. So I don't know if we want to get into all that, but
what is it about those power dynamics that feels so oppressive? What is it like when those power dynamics aren't there? Can you give us a sort of compare and contrast of those experiences?
So my first couple years university, when I was in my first play, I was terrified as an actor. I thought that I needed to be told how to move my arms, how to move across the stage, and I assume that's something I picked up just from learning at university for a couple years. And then when I started doing Village, I was like, whoa, it's not supposed to be so rigid, and you're told everything exactly you need to do. And so I felt I gained this confidence within myself. After going back and doing university after that, I felt I had so much more freedom. It's from as an actor and as a director, because directing my scenes, I'm aware of the grade and stuff, but I try to make it a collaboration, and I want my actors to feel safe and comfortable. And
yeah, cool. Well, that's good to hear. It's nice that, you've been able to find that sense of freedom in your work and bring that to the university. Here's a question. How do we change that dynamic? How do we address this strange hierarchical power imbalance that exists? How can we challenge that without putting ourselves at risk?
I did a class last year with a younger instructor who is currently in the industry. The difference between that and people who are set in their ways and not open to adapting them.
The grizzled veteran.
Mm-hmm.
Are you finding that there's a new wave, a new vibe from this younger generation of educators?
Yes. I'll accept those words.
What about you, Yvette? How do you feel about this hierarchical system that we're talking about? And how can we find ways to address it or dismantle it, or at least thrive within knowing that it's there, and, not let it oppress us as much?
I think it's going to take time, because the institution is set up to protect itself.
Yeah.
We have faculty who are tenured, who've been there forever.
Mm-hmm.
and they are not leaving until they're ready to leave. So when we do hires after that, we have to be looking for younger, differently trained, diverse faculty. And that has to be, and I know the universities want to do that because that's been identified as a priority, like to diversify, to be more inclusive, to be more equity seeking. But there are systems in place that keep us from making those changes quickly. And so I think it's telling that Mady had a younger, hipper teacher who brought a different training into the space, and that made all the difference. You know, Maddie's talked about what Village has meant to her, to me, in terms of changing her thinking about learning about theater. And I think if we can, in the other places, support the change, like other trainings that we do, other teachings that we do that are not within the institution, but will still challenge the learning that we're given in the institution, that may help judge it a bit, right? But it's going to take time inside those institutions.
Yeah. So what would you say to the sort of emerging Indigenous artists who are kind of breaking out of these programs, or maybe who are looking to get into some of these roles, some of these educational roles that, you know, maybe they've finished their master's and they're kind of coming out, or they want to teach at a university and they don't know how to present themselves or how to work within that system or what to do? What would you say to somebody like that?
You know, I think Indigenous scholars and Indigenous trained, educated Indigenous theater practitioners are very, very valuable right now, and they can choose where they want to go. And so I think as they're looking for a spot, they need to be aware of whether it's spitting into the wind or whether that organization, that institution really wants to make the change. So don't waste your energy and your resources in a place that is just talking the talk. Look for an institution that actually looks like it's ready to change, and invest your energies there. Like I said at the beginning, we don't have critical mass, right? So we can't waste our precious people in places where they're just going to be squished by the system. They have to look for the places that are ready to make the change. Look for the tools that are going to help you. Look for the colleagues that are going to support you. Try things, and if it's not working for you, find another thing to do, because we have a lot of work to do.
Cool. That's really inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing that. If any of our listeners are looking to connect with either of you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
At Madison, Madyson, and then Richard, spelled like Richard.
And I'm not on any socials, but everybody knows you, Simon. So they can contact the Village Conservatory and be put in touch with me.
Wonderful. I just feel really privileged to be able to have spent this time with the both of you, to be able to listen to your experiences and to share in some of your stories and hear your feelings about those things. Quite lucky to be able to be in this position, to listen to you and to hear about the wonderful work that you're doing and to hear about your ideas for a brighter and better future. So thank you both so much. Thanks to anybody who's listening to this sweet little podcast called It Takes Two. If you want to listen to any other content that we make, there are other episodes available. We also have a podcast called Monkeys and Playbills, which is all about musical theater Broadway shows that had less than, I think, 100 performances on Broadway. And we will also have another podcast coming out shortly, which is called Tales of the Great Transfiguration, which is a narrative podcast written by a local playwright by the name of Ben Townsley, who is also a Vic alumni, funny enough. So, we're getting our grubby little fingers in everywhere we can, trying to support the most amazing, talented, cool, and wonderful people that we can find here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory. Thank you so much, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks both. Thanks, Mady. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.
It takes two.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of It Takes Two. Today's special guests were Mady Richard and Yvette Nolan, and this episode was hosted by Simon Miron. For the Vic Digital Studio, I'm Daphne Finlayson, your friendly neighborhood producer and editor. Music for this show is provided by Paul DeGurse, with clips used from Stephen Sondheim's Into the Woods. The Village Conservatory gratefully acknowledges the support of the Canada Council for the Arts in making this podcast possible. For more on this podcast and other offerings from the Vic, visit us at villageconservatory.com or follow us on social media at Village Conservatory. Thank you so much.